What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another video. This one is going to be all about making the gains, specifically 8 mistakes to avoid in the gym so that you continue to make gains or that you allow yourself to optimize your gains. It is the holiday season. It's just after Thanksgiving, going into Christmas. Typically, this time of the year, a lot of people like to eat a little bit of extra food. And my thought process is if you're going to eat extra food, might as well put that to good use and gain some lean tissue. You might gain some fat too. That's usually what people do in the wintertime, but a lot of people gain just fat and no muscle. So by avoiding these mistakes, as well as I'm going to make a part 2 about outside the gym mistakes to avoid. If you avoid them, you should be well on your way to making some good, solid, lean tissue gains throughout the wintertime and not falling into the trap of just saying, well, screw it, I'm going to gain a bunch of fat this winter. Because most people, if I were to poll a room of 100 people and say, hey, would you rather stay exactly the same, or would you rather get fat, or would you rather gain a little bit of extra muscle? Most people would probably say, I would say almost all people would probably say I'd rather gain some muscle. So by avoiding these mistakes that I'm going to talk about, you are going to allow yourself to spend your time in the gym more effectively and get more out of it. So before we hop into the specific mistakes, if you don't mind taking a second to like, subscribe, and if you like what you hear at the end, I would love to hear your feedback on this video or maybe recommendations for future videos. My goal is to continue to try and reach more people and grow the channel, and everything you guys can do on your end would be greatly appreciated. So with that out of the way, let's hop into the first mistake, which is not necessarily a gym mistake. It is a mistake of whether you go to the gym or not. It is inconsistency. You could legitimately make every single other mistake on this list, but if you're consistent, you'll probably make better gains than someone who doesn't make the next 7 mistakes, but is very on the wagon, off the wagon, very inconsistent. Typically, the thing that makes most people inconsistent is they bite off more than they can chew. They start with way more than they could ever sustain, and they try to keep it going. But as kind of motivation wears off, which is totally normal, they usually go back to nothing. It's really discouraging to start high, realize that you're doing too much, and dial it back a little bit. So a lot of people just say, screw it. This just doesn't work. I need to do all of this training and I'm not able to consistently. So I'm just going to stop. This is very, very common for next month, New Year's. A lot of people will stick to their program for a few weeks, maybe a few months if they're lucky, but oftentimes it's way unrealistic and not sustainable for most people. So to be more consistent, you want to start low. You want to give yourself something realistic that you know you can stick to, even when shit hits the fan. Of course, your training can fluctuate. Some weeks you might train twice or three times. Other times you might train 4 or 5 times. But if you're starting with 6 days per week, how long are you going to be able to sustain that in reality? For some people, you might be able to. If you love training, you're a training fanatic, and you would rather go to the gym than do basically anything else, then that's one thing. But be realistic with yourself. Maybe start with 2 days per week, maybe 3 days per week. Lifting 2 to 3 days per week, if you're doing most things right and avoiding most of the mistakes on this list, you can make great, great progress. And doing that forever, maybe say 49 or 50 weeks out of the year on average, you're going to make incredible progress. Probably 95% of the progress that's available to you. Of course, if you want to maximize your muscle gains, maybe a little bit more training than that, 4 or 5 days per week. But for most people, 2 to 3 days per week is pretty damn solid. And then if you stick to that for a while, you prove to yourself that you can be consistent, then you can always add to it. It's way more exciting and way more motivating to add to something than it is to do way too much and then have to dial it back, or do way too much and then just kind of quit for a couple months and then, get another wave of motivation and hop back on. So consistency, by far number 1. And number 2 is another thing that if you do 1 and 2 and skip all the rest, you're still going to make great gains. And that is not training with enough intensity. So not enough intensity is massive. And it is pretty much an epidemic in my experience, at least the gym that I go to. And I go to the gym with a lot of pretty high performing individuals. Most of the lifters at my gym are either soft guys or Delta Force guys, or, pretty high performing individuals. And I still see this, and it's unfortunate because you're just not using your gym time as well as you possibly could be, and you're leaving gains on the table. So a lot of people have the wrong idea of what intensity means. Intensity in a hypertrophy sense, in a muscle gain sense, simply means one thing: proximity to failure. How close to failure are you pushing your sets? And failure in this case is not just like inability to move. In my definition, it is inability to perform another rep with very locked in precision form. In other words, your first rep in a set of 10 to say 1 rep in the tank should look exactly like your 10th rep. It'll just be slower. The last rep will obviously be slower, not because you're trying to go slower, but because you're fatigued. And that's just what happens. However, when I see a lot of people training, their first rep and their last rep looks the same, but they're the same speed as well. And they stop. Like, oh, I was supposed to do 10 reps, so I stopped at 10. You are way better off doing some extra reps, even if it's not programmed. Say you're trying to do a set of 8 to 10 and you do 12 or 13 or 14 because you had that in you. That set is going to be way more effective than just stopping at 10. So generally speaking, for most people, for most lifts, for most hypertrophy goals, if you're within 2 reps of failure, that's a pretty effective set. Now, if you're more than that, if you're 3, 4, 5 reps shy of failure, it's not a completely useless set, but it's what I call a tweener set. So a tweener set is basically more difficult than a warm-up set. So it still causes some fatigue, but it's not hard enough to get to be like a true working set. So you get more fatigue, but you don't get as much out of the set. And the only way to make up for it and still make that training effective is to do more sets. And that can be an option. Some people do prefer training with high volume. Some people get best results training with higher volume, but you could also be more efficient with your gym time if you do fewer sets, but you take them closer to failure. Now, a lot of people think that they're a lot closer to failure than they actually are. So in order to know what 1 to 2 reps in the tank feels like, you need to actually train to failure once in a while with certain exercises in certain situations. I wouldn't take every single lift to failure unless you know exactly what you're doing and you're training with very low volume and you're super experienced and you're choosing fail-safe exercises. But taking an occasional isolation movement to failure, taking an occasional compound lift on a machine that won't come down and crush you, like a barbell bench press to failure, usually not the best idea. A barbell squat to failure, usually not the best idea. But taking a machine press to failure, usually that you're going to be totally fine occasionally doing that. Now, do you want to train all the way to failure? In most cases, it's not really worth it. I prefer sometimes training with very low volume and taking most of my sets to failure. Typically, there's going to be a trade-off somewhere. So if you're going to take more sets to failure, you got to use lower volume. You got to do fewer sets per muscle group per week. If you're going to leave a rep or 2 in the tank, you can kind of do some more moderate volume, not necessarily super high volume, but somewhere in the 10 to 15 sets per muscle group per week range is usually a pretty good spot, other than smaller muscle groups or muscle groups that are kind of lagging behind. But make sure you are bringing the intensity. It makes training more fun. It also makes training less fatiguing because you don't have to do as many sets. And it's also going to make you spend less time in the gym because you're just going to get in, get out, and get the job done and move on to live another day. Which brings us into mistake number 3, too much volume. So a lot of times, because people make mistake number 2, they have to do mistake number 3 because otherwise they wouldn't make any gains. They would just kind of be wasting their gym time. Too much volume. Volume in a hypertrophy sense means sets per muscle group per week. Technically speaking, volume is sets times reps times load, but I consider that workload. And when we're talking about muscle gain, the thing that matters most is how many working sets, how many hard sets, abiding by the last one, you do per week per muscle group. Most research shows that 12 to 20 hard sets per muscle group per week is a pretty good sweet spot. There have been some newer studies that show that higher volume can work, but in a practicality sense, especially if you want to recover and you feel good and not bang up your joints and not spend hours and hours in the gym, I usually recommend, if you're training pretty hard, 1 to 2 reps shy of failure, maybe occasionally 2 failure, somewhere in that 10 to 15 range. Sometimes for some people, even fewer than that. For certain muscle groups or certain lifts, if you're like a very strong individual and you train very hard, you might only need 6 or 7 sets per muscle group per week. If you don't train quite as hard, or if you know you recover really well, maybe 15, 16, 17, maybe 20. Maybe certain muscle groups, if they're lagging and they don't grow like other muscle groups in your body do, or if you want to really emphasize a certain part of your body during a training block, then maybe you can do some more sets, 20, 22, 23. However, more volume usually means more fatigue as opposed to more intensity. So if you're doing 8 to 10 hard sets per week, really, really hard sets, very intense, versus 20 to 25, somewhat hard, more like tweener sets, maybe 3 reps shy of failure, maybe 4, you're going to probably develop more fatigue doing a ladder because it's just more times that your mind has to get ramped up for a set and focused for a set. And it's also just more times that you're putting your body through that range of motion. And of course, it's just going to take a lot longer because you're doing more sets. So make sure you're not doing ridiculous amounts of volume. A lot of people will think they have to train 6 days per week or they have to do 5 sets of every single exercise. I have a syndrome called 5 sets of everything syndrome. I'm sure you guys have probably seen programs where every single movement of every single training day is 5 sets. It's just excessive and a waste of time, and it's inefficient. And you are much better off getting the most out of your sets by training hard and doing fewer sets, generally speaking. Which brings us into mistake number 4. Mistake number 4 is poor exercise selection. And this one is very, very common. And it's partially because a lot of people think that just because an exercise is considered good or optimal on paper means it's good for them. And it's not always the case. Everyone has different anthropometry, which is essentially limb length. Everyone has different leverages. So maybe what is a really good lift for your buddy may not be the best lift for you. For me, for example, I spent most of my 20s squatting a couple of times per week with a barbell on my back. And although I got my squat pretty heavy, I mean, decently heavy, I was in the mid 400s at 185 pounds or so as like a skinny endurance guy. My legs did not grow at all. And I would do higher reps and I would try and make them grow from my barbell squats. But because my leverages and because my anthropometry is not very conducive to getting great quad stimulus out of a back squat, they just didn't really grow. So I was super strong, and you would have never guessed that looking at my legs that I squatted in the mid 400s, but I wanted to actually improve my leg size. And my goals kind of changed when I hit 30. Squatting was banging me up a little bit, back squatting, of course. So I really started to focus more on hypertrophy, and I changed the squat selection. I started wearing squat shoes. I started really focusing on range of motion more so than just adding load to the bar every single time. I really enjoy doing belt squats and hack squats and leg presses and pendulum squats. And I just get a lot more quad growth out of it. So my quads are a lot bigger now. I look stronger now than I used to be, but I'm not because I don't really back squat anymore. If I decided to start back squatting again, I would have the potential to get stronger, but I just don't really care about that anymore. And I don't want to feel banged up all the time. And it's just not worth it for me. But that's just one example. And that's just my example, N of 1. Everyone has certain lifts that they're going to be really good at, and certain lifts they're not going to be very good at. Generally, the criteria that I like to use are: 1, can you feel it in your target muscles? So if you're doing a back squat, for example, I'm not trying to pick on the back squat, but it's an easy one. If all you can feel is your lower back and your knees and maybe your glutes a little bit, it's not a great quad exercise for you. That doesn't mean it's a bad exercise. It's just not going to really grow your quads. And that's what we're talking about right now, hypertrophy. However, some people that are built really well for squatting, maybe they feel it like crazy. They get a crazy quad pump doing a back squat. Then it's a great exercise for them. So long as, number 2, I don't feel it in my joints. I don't feel really, really sore or inflamed joints from doing the movement either during the training session, right after, the next day, or just kind of chronically. So again, if you're back squatting and all you can feel is your knees and you don't really feel anything in your quads, then it's probably not the best exercise for you. And it's not a required lift unless, of course, you are a power lifter and you have to back squat. So a little bit of joint discomfort is fine, but if it's really, really bothering them, or if it's just a chronic thing like your knees, oh shit, I have to squat again, my knees are going to bother me for the next 3 days, probably not worth it. The next one is, do you fail it due to your target muscles or a different muscle? For example, we'll talk about the back squat again. Are you failing back squats because of your quads, because of your legs, or are you failing it because of your core, your low back, maybe your upper back, parts of your body that they're definitely supporting you in that lift, but they're not the main muscle group that you're actually trying to develop? Nothing wrong with occasionally doing lifts where the target muscle is not the point of failure, but generally, to maximize hypertrophy, you are going to want to make sure you're just choosing a lift where the target muscle is the point of failure. And the last one is, you want to make sure it doesn't wreck you systemically / central nervous system wise for the next day, then 2 days after. Certain lifts, if you have certain goals, if you're a power lifter, of course, you have to do deadlift, bench, and squat, and you might be a little fatigued and run down the following days. However, if you're just trying to gain muscle and you're trying to maybe get stronger too, usually those coincide with one another. They're not exactly the same, but there's definitely some overlap, especially at lower levels, maybe not so much once you get super advanced. But if you're choosing a bunch of exercises that maybe they fit all the criteria I just talked about, but they just wreck you, like the next day, you just don't feel like doing anything, either training wise or even life wise, you maybe just feel down and not that great, then it's probably not worth doing for you, because there's probably another option. So I always say there are no required exercises, just required movement patterns. And for each movement pattern, the squat, the hinge, the vertical and horizontal push, the vertical and horizontal pull, there are tons and tons of different exercise variations that you can choose from. So really using that criteria and finding the right movements for you is key. Which brings us into number 5, poor exercise execution. A lot of people just don't spend any time trying to lock in their form. Some of the biggest culprits for types of movements that I see poorly executed are any sort of row that is targeting the upper back. Usually people have no idea what to do with their execution on upper back focused rows. It usually just becomes a curl. They're kind of curling their forearm up to their bicep. They finish the set and they have a massive bicep and forearm pump, or their grip kind of fails if they're not using straps, which I wouldn't recommend not using straps if you're trying to build your upper back. They don't really have an upper back pump. Most lifters have never experienced an upper back pump. That is my opinion, but I think that's pretty damn accurate. Other exercises, squats, it's rare that I see someone squat below parallel. It is also rare that I see someone do a really nice RDL. In fact, most of the nice RDLs that I see in my gym are from females, which is fucking awesome. But I don't see a lot of males doing RDLs, let alone doing them really well, or any sort of other hinge movement similar to that. The lateral raise is another one that I see people just kind of like bird winging. Like if your hand is higher than your shoulder at the top of a lateral raise because your arm is bent, then you're not really working your lateral delts. And it shows because a lot of people don't have well-developed lateral delts. So really take some time, maybe watch some YouTube videos. I have a million different exercise execution explanation videos on my YouTube channel. And that's just my YouTube channel. There's many people out there with way more thorough and higher volume exercise demos that you can go through and film yourself and watch yourself do it afterwards, or hire a coach that can help you. Hey, fix this, this, and this, and you're going to be executing this really well. And it's actually going to be hitting the target muscles and it's not going to be stressing your joints. That's the main thing with poor execution. Not only is it less effective for growing your muscles, but it's also going to bang your joints up more and stress your joints and make it very difficult not to make mistake number 1 and be inconsistent. So exercise execution, you are never too young to start worrying about it. You're going to be stronger. It's going to improve your lifts, and it's also going to make you feel better. And you're going to embarrass yourself a little bit less in the gym amongst people who actually know what good form looks like. Which brings us into number 6, which is poor exercise sequencing. Almost everyone thinks that you have to do your big barbell lifts first or your big compound lifts first in every single workout, which for some people, that is appropriate. If your main goal is to get strong in a big compound lift, then you should definitely do it very close to the beginning of the workout. Maybe not first, but very close to first. I personally believe, and I have experience with my programming as well as countless other clients' programming, setting up your exercise sequencing in a slightly what most would consider a reverse manner is a much better option for the most part. So for example, on a leg day, instead of going in and warming up and then just going straight to barbell back squats, if you're about to go do barbell back squats, great. But maybe do some other exercises that are not super fatiguing, but help you warm up the lower body a little bit more. For example, you'd maybe do some backward sled dragging and some leg curls. So you get a hamstring pump, you get a little bit of a quad pump, you get a lot of blood flow to the legs. Neither of these things, unless you load the backward sled drag way too heavy, which I don't recommend, it should be relatively light. Neither of those are going to fatigue you to any considerable degree for your squats. And you're just going to feel a hell of a lot better when you go into your squats. Your joints are going to feel better. You typically don't hurt yourself when you have a nice pump. Most people, when they get hurt in the gym, they don't have this amazing pump in the part of the body that they got hurt in. So this is not something you're going to find in a textbook. It's not something you're going to find in a study. This is just something based off programming experience and learning from people who also do this. John Meadows was well known for having more of a reverse programming approach where most people will do hamstring curls last, throw hamstring curls in first before you do squats, and watch what happens. It's most likely going to not detract from your squat. If anything, it's going to help them because you're going to be more warmed up. And also you're going to not do your leg curls, which are still important, as a check the block exercise at the very end of your workout when you're already completely smoked. So for an upper body example, maybe instead of just going and doing bench press as your very first exercise, maybe you go and do some jumping push-ups to kind of get your nervous system ramped up, get your joints ramped up. then maybe some light flies or even some light dumbbell presses just to get a little bit of a pump in the musculature, almost like a winning warm-up, except not quite as high a volume and not quite as potentially fatiguing. You guys can look winning warm-ups up if you want, but especially if you're over, I would say about 30 years old, maybe 35, going into that first lift with a little bit of a pump, having already done a movement for that muscle group, just not a very fatiguing one, or a movement for the supporting muscle group, in the case of the leg curls for the squat, is a highly, highly recommended and very rarely programmed strategy. But I would suggest considering it instead of just running into the gym, warming up and loading the back squat or loading the bench press or whatever your main lift of the day is. Doing that second or third can be a very, very good strategy. Just something to consider. Which brings us into mistake number 7, which is jacked up rest periods. So in my observation, most people either barely rest at all, definitely not long enough, oftentimes because they're making mistake number 2 and not training hard enough, so they don't feel like they need more rest, or they think that resting less and making their training more into cardio is going to help them because it's just going to give them the best of both worlds. Like, I'm getting a great cardio stimulus and I'm getting a muscle gain stimulus, and that's not the case. The more your lifting looks like cardio, the less effective it's going to be for actual muscle growth, and also it's not very effective for cardio. You can just do cardio separately. Of course, there's definitely value to circuit training occasionally, but not necessarily for gains. It's not going to maximize your hypertrophy. The other end of the spectrum, a lot of people will just death scroll for 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 10 minutes. I have no idea how many minutes in between sets, and wonder why they just aren't really all that into their training session. They'll wonder why they're, very, very inconsistent with their performance in the gym. It's because you are distracting the shit out of yourself. You're getting all these dopamine hits in between sets. You're resting various amounts of times. Maybe one time you might rest 3 minutes, which is great. Then maybe next set you're resting 7 minutes. How are you supposed to track your progress? And how are you supposed to actually be able to bring your focus back into your actual training after 7 minutes of scrolling or 9 minutes of scrolling or texting or whatever you're doing? So what is the answer? Somewhere in the middle there. Usually for a compound lift, lower body compound lift, if you're super strong, maybe 3-4 minutes in between sets, maybe 5 for some people for certain exercises. If it's an upper body, usually those are a little bit less overall systemically fatiguing. So maybe 2.5 to 3, maybe 4 minutes, depending on the person, depending on the lift in between sets. If it's an isolation movement, probably only need 1 or 2 minutes in between sets. If it's a single leg movement, you absolutely do want to take rest in between legs, usually 90 seconds, maybe up to 2 or 3 minutes, depending on the lift, depending on the lifter and how strong you are. Sometimes when I do split squats, I will rest up to 3 minutes in between legs and then another 3 minutes in between sets. So factor that in. If you're doing 4 or 5 sets of split squats, that's really 10 sets if you're doing it properly. And if you avoid mistake number 2 and you actually train hard, you don't need that many sets. And you can take your rest periods in between legs. So making sure that you're resting somewhere in the 1 to 2 minute range for most isolation movements, somewhere in the 2 to 4, maybe 5 range for compound lifts is critical. And it's going to allow you to focus because you're not going to be fucking scrolling in between sets. And it's also going to allow you to standardize your training so you can actually track your progress based on how long you're resting. So don't turn lifting into cardio, unless of course your goal is to just get better at circuit training, which you probably wouldn't still be watching this video if it was. And also don't death scroll for however many minutes in between every set. You're going to have way better training sessions. And also it's going to give you an added bonus of not being on your phone for an hour a day, which anyone can benefit from. Today's world, we spend way too much time on our phone anyway. So taking that hour and a half while you're in the gym off from looking at your phone, or maybe looking at your phone to change the song or something along those lines, or write in the stats from your last set, or maybe watch your video, something productive like that, that's not just going to drain you of dopamine, is what I would recommend. And then finally, last mistake is program hopping or not following a program and just trying to Tetris your way to your gains. Unless you are very, very savvy with programming, and most people aren't, most people who think they are not. Even people who are qualified in fitness, even people who have certifications are not very good at programming, because most certifications don't teach you how to program. You learn how to program from really good programmers, as well as trial and error, as well as continued education that is not necessarily going to be found in a nationally accredited certification like NASM or something along those lines. That's how you learn how to program well. And unless you're someone like that, you probably should follow a program or hire a coach. Additionally, once you start that program, stick to it. If you don't see results in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, that doesn't mean you're not getting results. It doesn't mean you're not getting better. Results don't happen linearly and they don't happen quickly unless you're an absolute beginner. So stick to things. Of course, if it's injuring you or just destroying you, if the program's absolutely ridiculous, that's one thing. But if you hit a plateau or if you get bored after a couple weeks of doing the same program, that is part of the process. You should stick to it, because once you continue to do the same thing over and over again and progress and add load or add range of motion or do more sets with the same load, that is progress, and it's a little bit boring. Honestly, your program should be relatively boring after a few weeks once the novelty wears off. Those are usually the most effective programs. But if you're always changing things up all the time, or if you're just trying to like piece together your program from, things you've seen or videos you've watched, usually it's not going to go very well for you, and you'd be way better off just getting a program, sticking to it. My hypertrophy program is 19 weeks long. I'll put that in the description. I also have a hypertrophy program on Train Heroic. I will also put that in the description. Those are good starting points. There's tons of other options out there, but you are way better off having something in front of you than just kind of winging it and hoping for the best, or seeing a plateau after 3 weeks and being like, and you know what, I'll try a different program. So that wraps it up. That's the 8 mistakes. If you're able to avoid these mistakes when it comes to training, as well as in my next video, avoid the mistakes outside the gym, you are going to be well on your way to a winter full of lean muscle gain and enjoying yourself and really making the most out of the extra calories that you're potentially going to eat around Christmas. So thanks for watching, guys. I'll be back soon. Till then, Terminator out.